Welcome to the Everything Building Envelope podcast. On this show, we discuss topics relating to the exterior building envelope, such as waterproofing, glazing, cladding, roofing, and more. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. For previous episodes, show notes, and bonus video content, check out our website, everythingbuildingenvelope.com. Now, here's your host for the Everything Building Envelope podcast, Paul Beers.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Everything Building Envelope podcast. Today, we have our first repeat guest in the podcast series, Will Smith, who I work with at GCI Consultants. Will, welcome back.
Thank you. Glad to be here, Paul.
Yeah, so last time we talked about water infiltration testing, and that was, I believe, our most listened to podcast. I think that really resonated with the audience. And today we've talked and decided that we're going to talk about hurricanes and hurricane protection. We've been in Florida for quite some time through all the hurricane activities and Hurricane Andrew and everything beyond, right?
Yeah, too many years to even admit, but yes, I've experienced quite a bit.
So maybe you just tell us a little bit about what some of the things that, maybe starting with Andrew, what some of your experiences have been and kind of, through the years, so to speak.
Okay, well, first let me emphasize that our discussion here today is, as far as hurricanes and so forth, that we're talking about wind resistance, not flood resistance. That's another whole subject. I want to concentrate today on wind issues. And just to give you a little bit more of the background, I've been in Florida over 50 years now, and yes, I've gone through a lot of hurricanes. But my first real investigation of hurricane storm damages was in 1992 after Hurricane Andrew. There were 10 storms that year, but that one everyone seems to remember most vividly because it caused over $26 billion in damage and several deaths. I ended up spending several days or weeks there on the ground evaluating the damages immediately following that storm. And then 1995, that was another rather active hurricane season. There were actually 21 storms that year. You may remember Hurricane Opal, Hurricane Maryland, for example. They were very damaging storms. And in fact, in 1995, over 160 people lost their lives in hurricanes, and there was very significant damage. I guess in total, I've had boots on the ground performing hurricane investigations for a number of years, a number of different locations all over the East Coast and the Gulf Coast states. And I've spent, as a result of that, I've spent many, many hours promoting revisions that have been aimed at strengthening the building codes and standards. And now, recently, although the United States has been somewhat spared in recent years from wind damages, the threat's still out there. We can't let this disappear.
Yeah, apathy is a big thing when memory is often short with the hurricane threat. You mentioned Hurricane Opal, and that reminded me that, you and I were together in Atlanta when Hurricane Opal hit in the Florida Panhandle, and we were actually at the Southern Standard Building Code hearings where they were considering some changes to the building codes for hurricane protection, and those changes were not adopted at that time. Meanwhile, there was a hurricane striking the Panhandle, and we actually hopped in the car and drove down there. So where are we today, or where have we come from there to today as far as what's going on in the construction industry and building codes and hurricanes?
Well, we learned a lot. One of the first things I think we learned, and this goes back in the early 1990s, right after Hurricane Andrew, we thought at that time that Florida was, for example, we knew wind. We knew what hurricanes were. We're best to experience a hurricane in Florida, so we knew what wind is all about. But what the engineering community found out immediately following Andrew was that, no, we really didn't know wind very well, and we had poorly addressed the effects of windstorms in the building codes. And the wind pressures that were calculated according to the building code, that buildings had to resist wind pressure, but the calculations were wrong. They weren't adequate. And we also didn't adequately address construction materials and methods and how to resist wind pressures, such things that are as simple as properly bracing the roof structures or tying down roofs. We thought we had that taken care of, but we really hadn't done a very good job of it. And 1992 seemed to be a wake-up call. At that point, a lot of code revisions were introduced. Unfortunately, it took a long time for some of those to get through, but we found out that
we need to figure out a way to tie everything together, tie the building together, to make sure that during a windstorm it doesn't come apart. Because one of the most important things we found out is that the building codes may have addressed wind pressure, maybe not very well, but they did address wind pressure. But what they didn't address is the fact that when the wind blows, it can damage vegetation, picks up debris, and so forth. And this debris gets introduced into the wind field, and that crashes into the building, and it can cause significant damage to the building. Worse, if that debris makes a hole in the side of the building, for example, if it hits a window or door and the glass is broken out, this allows the hurricane wind then to enter into the building. And when you couple those pressures on the inside of the building with the pressures that are already on the outside of the building, it can create catastrophic building failure. So the building codes recognize that these pressures not only had to be addressed properly and that the materials had to be able to resist the pressure, but also not just pressure, but we needed to figure out a way to resist the debris that's carried by those blowing winds. And that's when new standards were developed that would address windborne debris and testing for windows, doors, and other components to resist that windborne debris.
Yes, and you and I working together through a lot of that, and it was, I think you'll agree with me, we were frustrated at times at the slow pace of adoption for something that seemed so obvious, but eventually, it did get adopted. So how has the construction industry responded to basically, the new codes that came into place in the mid to late 90s?
Well, the interesting thing about that is, just like you said, in 1992, 93, 94, back in that area, when the proposed changes were first introduced, some manufacturers and industry professionals vigorously opposed it. We heard predictions, you may remember back then, no window and door manufacturer could ever make a product that will pass this type of a test. We heard claims that additional construction costs would bring residential and commercial construction to an absolute standstill. But what actually happened was the building code industry, if you will, the building code committees did make the changes. As a result, made industry respond to those changes. And what we found was actually innovation of products that were introduced into the market. Now there are literally thousands of products that have been tested satisfactorily that satisfy these requirements. And not only that, as anyone can see just looking around in the coastal United States, construction's booming. It didn't bring construction to a standstill, not at all. Construction's still going strong. And we got the products now that are able to satisfy these requirements.
So I've always said that if you're building buildings where there's hurricanes, you ought to design them for hurricanes, which wasn't always the case. This makes a lot of sense. So now, we've got some history. The codes have been improved, and there's been a bunch of hurricanes here, in Caribbean, coastal United States, places like that. How do the new buildings do when subject to hurricane or severe wind storms?
I think we've seen some evidence that the changes that are made have been very successful. There hasn't been a real good, thorough, in-depth study made, but that is recently anyways. But I found one that was done about 10 years. This was done after the storms in August and September of 2004, about 10 years after some of the implementation of the major code. And it was found that during those storms, that 4 major storms that hit in Florida in August and September of 2004, there were no deaths in any structure that was built under the revised building codes, and that damages to those buildings because of wind was very minor. So I think the success of these changes has been seen, and we're going to continue to see it as time goes on, because as you know, and as you said, hurricanes, they're going to continue to come. They're not going to go away because you can't be complacent. They're going to happen.
It's kind of like when they do happen, I'm thinking back to 04 and 05. It's kind of like urban renewal, because the buildings that aren't as well built, the windows and doors and other, roofs and other components get damaged. And that obviously causes building owners to act. Sometimes it's insurance proceeds. Other times they just do it because they recognize the need, or they have to do it because of damage. And the building stock is always improving. So given that fact that new buildings are being built well, older buildings are being renovated, where does that bring us to today? Does that mean you're probably not going to have as much flying debris? And would you expect to see more improvement because of the continual upgrading of the building stock?
I think we're going to see more improvement because of the upgrade of the buildings as they go along, but we're not going to eliminate windborne debris. Windborne debris is one of the common things that we found in some of the hurricane investigations back years ago were 2x4s because buildings were coming apart. But it wasn't limited to that. We found a lot of vegetation from trees and branches and roofing shingles and things like this. So you're going to minimize things like roofing shingles because the code has been improved, but you're not going to totally eliminate these things. I think, however, we're going to minimize the damage because we're going to be constructing buildings as time goes on more secure and more fortified to resist the damages that can be inflicted by this flying debris.
So let's fast forward to today. We have a lot of architect, building owners, construction professionals listening. What should they be doing as they're designing and building buildings to get the maximum protection or benefit at this point?
Well, we need to look at several different aspects of this. It's not just design and building. That is important. We need to, building owners, building designers need to consider, obviously they need to build it in accordance with the code, but those locations that are hurricane-prone locations, they have an option when it comes to the exterior of the building and the openings in the building, like windows, doors, louvers, vents, those types of things. They can either design the building using products that have been certified and tested for resistance not only to wind but also to windborne debris, or they can provide alternatives such as shutters that can be installed over those products and that could be damaged in the event of a hurricane. Of course, designer has to take into account the use of the building. For example, if you have a building that's occupied by the elderly or infirmed, or if you have a multi-story building, installing shutters is no easy task, and sometimes it's absolutely impossible. So the designer has to take into consideration the end use of the building and the application of those products. We also, though, we need to reach out to business owners and understand that not only is your own personal property, your home, need to be considered, but your business needs to be considered. Think about the window and door protection that you have in the property that you occupy is even if it's an existing building? Do you need to upgrade what you have? Do you need to consider checking with the local building department look at what the requirements are and use products or install some new products to upgrade your building so you don't have to worry about throwing plywood over the side of the building to protect against flying debris in a coming windstorm? You may want to go ahead and be proactive and take these preparations now. Also think of your employees and coworkers. Are they going to be able to go on? Frankly, we're probably going to lose power when the hurricane goes down. What about the data in your business? What about your operation? How do you keep it going? Make sure you develop a plan for your home and your business, that you protect your building, and that you be prepared to implement those plans as soon as it's necessary. And when a storm is approaching and you're told it's time to go and put your hurricane plan in effect, that's no joke. That's time if you don't have a plan by then, it's too late. It's time now, before we get to that point, it's time now to act and get prepared.
Yeah, so, at GCI Consultants, we've talked about this a lot. We're in the hurricane business. I like to think we get it. And, you mentioned some business sustainability issues that obviously were beyond protecting the building, such as protecting your data and your records and whatnot. And the cloud is a beautiful thing. I mean, I remember we used to be so concerned we'd have to do backup tapes on our servers and really worry about, the building being damaged, power going out and all that. And we've actually conquered that to where we don't even think about it. Last year when Hurricane Matthew came, we worried about our employees and, were they going to be okay, and, securing what little bit we had around the office. But we were running, up and running the whole time. And it's great what technology has done for that.
That's right. And I think there's a lot of help that people can get. They can go to, if they feel overwhelmed, all they got to do is go to the Hurricane Center website. It's NHC, National Hurricane Center, .noaa.gov. And they have a web page there that for both individual homeowners and businesses that give you a whole list of these things you can go down to protect your home, your employees, your business, and get prepared for these things. Because like we've been trying to say here, if you wait until the storm is announced and you got to buckle down and you haven't done it by then, it's too late.
That's exactly right. The time to do a hurricane plan is before the hurricane, not as it's bearing down on the coastline. I want to back up for a second. We were talking before about windows and doors and wind and debris and everything. What about water? We're not talking about flood here. I'm talking about like water, rainwater, and water coming in through the exterior building envelope. How do you account for that during a hurricane?
You're right. The windows and doors have to be tested and certified according to certain standards that are in publication that include not only the windborne debris that we've been talking about, and wind, as we've been talking about, but also they have to resist water infiltration to a certain level of performance. Unfortunately, that level of performance is a percentage of the actual wind pressures that can be experienced during a hurricane event. So we've seen hurricane events that the windows and doors have held together fine, but they leaked. So we encourage new construction projects and architects and designers, rather, of new construction projects to look for those products that have the highest possible testing response or numbers for resistance to water, because although wind damage can be catastrophic, water damage inside a building can also be an extremely serious damaging problem that can cost thousands and thousands of dollars to repair.
I was just thinking back to one of the prior guests on the podcast. Ray Crawford has developed a window that is tested far and above the building code requirements. I think it does 100 pounds per square foot for a water test, and that's for, it's a fixed window for an office building. But the building codes contain minimum standards, and so often we see the goal is to meet the code requirements. Is it appropriate to exceed the code requirements sometimes? And could you maybe give some examples for that?
It's certainly appropriate. We can always do that. And in fact, particularly in some of the commercial buildings that we see and high-rise buildings that we see in the South Florida market, where we're susceptible to hurricane damage or hurricane events, the building codes, like we're talking about, the standards have these resistance for wind pressures up to a certain maximum requirement. And like I said, the water is a percentage of that according to the standards, but then there's a cap on that number. Like you mentioned, Crawford has 100 PSF resistance to water. Well, the applicable standard requires that you test at a certain percentage of the wind up to, for water, up to a maximum of 12, not 100. Now, is 12 adequate? In some cases, for example, in my home, I live in a low-rise home. 12 is more than adequate for my home. But if I lived on the 30th floor, for example, of a high-rise condominium in South Florida, 12 may be very questionable. So it'd be appropriate in many cases, particularly in high-rise, where you're very susceptible to these kind of conditions. It's very appropriate to look for performance that exceeds what is necessary according to the code. And as you said, the code is a minimum requirement, not a maximum. It's a minimum. So you can always build above the minimum. Of course, everybody has to recognize that if you want to exceed those requirements, you're probably going to have to pay a little more money for it.
You get what you pay for a lot of times.
Absolutely. And however, even though you get what you pay for, you may be willing, 10 years from now, if you experience one of those storms, you would may be very willing and very happy that you paid that extra money to resist that type of damage and problem.
When you make the investment, the thing with the hurricane protection is it's not instant gratification. Nobody wishes for a hurricane. In fact, I think plenty of people would be happy to make the investment and never have one. But it sure does feel good. I put new windows in my house a couple of years ago, and last year I was actually hiking in Morocco when Hurricane Matthew was threatening, and I was really happy that I didn't have to worry about closing shutters and preparing or anything, because once you have those products installed, you're ready. You're ready 24/7 basically.
Exactly. Unlike some of the other, what you're talking about in that type of product is passive protection. It's always there. It's always ready, as opposed to something like shutters, which is an active thing. Somebody has to go out there, put the shutters up, or install whatever has to be installed in order to give the protection.
So if we have let's say a commercial or multifamily residential building that we're going to design or construct, we go out and we do all the right things as far as finding the suitable products that meet or exceed the code, getting a good water leakage resistance rating on it. What's the other thing that obviously people would need to be concerned about is installation, because the greatest products, if they foul up the installation, aren't going to perform. And I think this kind of relates back to our water testing podcast as well. But could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. You're absolutely right. The best products in the world are only as good as the installer who put them in the building. You can spend a lot of money for the highest quality window, door, or exterior building component that money can buy, but if it's installed improperly, it's not going to work. And you're going to have trouble, whether it be a failure of the product itself, water leakage, air leakage, too much thermal transmission. There's all kinds of things that can go wrong. So installation is crucial, and it needs to be monitored, particularly in buildings of significance, such as a high-rise condominium or commercial building. And the reason for that is because these buildings are, because they are so large, because they're so spread out, there's several crews working at different times and in different locations on the building. And those crews change sometimes daily. You get different people doing different things, and they don't even keep up with each other. It's hard for them to keep up with each other. So somebody needs to monitor it and make sure it's done according to the requirements and is able to satisfy the performance expectations of the owners. So it's important, we believe, particularly in new construction projects, to have a consulting firm such as GCI out there to monitor installations, to oversee the inspections that are done, to make sure that the installations of the work is done in accordance with the requirements, and at least in that way that the occupants are going to have some sense that the performance will satisfy the requirements, and that maybe we can hope that they're not going to leak when the next rainstorm comes through.
So let's talk a little bit also about water infiltration testing again. We've got a portfolio of projects and clients and whatnot where we've worked with them and gone through the inspection and whatnot, and also done the field water infiltration testing. Can you talk a little bit about what happens typically early on in the testing process, and where we try to end up, and then how that translates into performance in severe weather later on?
Yeah, for new building construction, we like to recommend that as early as possible in the installation process, that representative windows and doors are field tested for resistance to water leakage. In an installed condition, that is, with all the exterior wall finishes in place, with the sealants around the windows and doors in place, so everything's tested as it should be. Unfortunately, historically, we found out many years ago that when doing that, we find that 60 to 70% of those installations fail the first test. But the reason for the failure was because of installation deficiencies, which is why we want to do that test very early in the construction phase so we can find those installation deficiencies, correct them, retest it until it's right, and then that becomes a standard for the balance of the installation of the project. Then as the project goes on, we'll sporadically test others as spot checks to make sure that quality is maintained throughout the construction process. And hopefully then, by doing this, gives the owner an assurance that the products that they've specified have been installed as they're required, and they resist the water leakage that could occur in the event of a rainstorm.
And they end up generally with a good result when they go through that process.
We've had pretty good success doing that, but again, it needs to be understood by all that nothing is perfect and nothing is foolproof. We cannot, we could, but most people are not going to want us out there to test every single window and door that goes into a high-rise building, and some work gets covered over. But we can be out there enough during the inspection process along with the testing so that we can uncover these problems as they go along and make sure they're fixed.
Yeah, the concept, I think, is to not to have a systemic problem. In other words, have water infiltration where it floods the whole building. And if you have a high-rise building and you get hit with a major windstorm, rainstorm, whatever, and you have, say, 3 leaks, you're happy. You've made it. I mean, you don't want any leaks, but what you don't want is 300 leaks and massive problems.
Exactly correct. That's right.
Any recommendations for people about what they should be thinking about and what they should be doing with hurricane season upon us?
Yeah, I think right now, remember, friends, family, coworkers are not all going to be together when the storm hits, so now's the time to make a plan. Figure out how you're going to contact each other once the storm or after the storm is over. Assemble a supply kit for your home or your business with at least 3 days supply of water, non-perishable food. Remember that you're probably going to lose power, so include a supply of batteries and battery-powered radios, flashlights, and so on. Get yourself a first aid kit, and just be prepared. Be prepared to, if you're going to ride out the storm, be prepared to ride out and stay there during the storm and stay there afterwards when you're going to be low on, or when you may not have power. But understand that you need to be prepared to evacuate, especially if you're in a flood zone. When the authorities come on the air and tell you that it's time to get out of your business or time to get out of your home, go get shelter. Don't mess around. They don't make those decisions lightly. They have your life safety in mind. And for your business, remember that you're also going to be out without power for several days. So develop a plan of action that assures that the safety of your data, your equipment, and your employees is first and foremost.
Great advice. So thank you very much, Will, for being the first repeat guest on Everything Building Envelope.
My pleasure. I look forward to doing it again.
Yeah, we will, because as we've been together longer than we care to admit, and we've got lots to talk about.
That's right.
So I'd like to thank everybody for listening, and this is a really appropriate subject for hurricane season, obviously. We have a newsletter. If you're interested in receiving the Everything Building Envelope newsletter, all you have to do is text the word building envelope to 22828. Again, text the word building envelope to 22828. So thank you again, everyone, for listening. Until next time, this is Paul Beer saying so long.
Thanks for joining us today. Please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. For more information on the Everything Building Envelope, previous episodes, show notes, bonus video content, and much more, check out our website, everythingbuildingenvelope.com.